Dasidele, and welcome to the third episode of A Mission for Tibet. This is a series produced by Londonney, and it focuses on topics that are not covered by other media outlets. You can view the previous interviews in Tibetan language and in English language on Londonney's YouTube channel. Today, we are very fortunate to have Zara Fleming with us. To give a brief introduction, Zara Fleming has dedicated her life to study Tibetan art and culture and the art and culture of the wider Himalaya region. And she was the chairperson of Tibet Relief Fund and the Tibet Society in 1996 to 2001. And she's given many lectures at universities and also curated exhibitions at museums in Europe, Australia and New Zealand. Besides being an expert of Tibetan art, she is also an experienced tour guide. She has led groups to Ladakh, Spiti, Bhutan, Nepal and Tibet. So first of all, thank you, Zara, for joining us today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And to start things off, could you please tell us a little bit about your family background and your upbringing before you encountered Tibet?
Okay, I was born in Suffolk in the east of England, and my parents ran a farm. Actually, my mum during the war, she worked at Bletchley, so she was like a spy, really. And when I was, so my upbringing was on a farm, and in my school, when I was 7, was 1959, the year His Holiness came out. And we had a teacher who told us what had happened in Tibet. And we then raised money for Tibetan children. And we wrote, various children who then came to England. I don't know exactly what happened because I didn't have a pen pal, but we collected money for these children. And I used to say to my parents, you know, I'm going to go to Tibet one day. And when I was little, I was actually very fat. And so my eyes often vanished from my face. And my parents used to say I was Chinese or Tibetan. And I said, I am not Chinese, I am Tibetan. But that interest was always there. I had colouring books and things about Tibet. So it was somewhere I always wanted to go.
And like, when did you first meet Tibetans? Because I'm assuming back then there was I don't know if there was any Tibetan in Suffolk. Or...
No Tibetans in Suffolk. And really no Tibetans when I was at school. I used to get books out from the library, but not about Tibet so much, although I did read, my parents had 7 years in Tibet and a couple of other books, and then I did a training for working in museums and an art degree. And then when I was 20, my grandmother died, and she left me £150 for travel. Now you couldn't go to Tibet, but those were the days you could get an overland truck to Kathmandu. From London to Kathmandu. And I went with a friend, but we worked in Europe for 3 months to raise some money. And then this truck, like a converted ambulance, 26 of us, it broke down on the outskirts of Delhi. But I made my way up to Kathmandu. And so Kathmandu was the place that I first met Tibetans and, you know, many refugees, and began to learn an awful lot more about the situation. And, you know, just understanding, you know, just meeting. One day I was trekking up near Jomsom, near Mustang, and meeting a family who had just come out, who wanted to sell various objects to give them some money. I didn't want them to part with these things, but we gave them some money. So I began to understand much more about what had happened then. You know, much more than just the Dalai Lama and the others escaping, but more about the history and everything. So that was my first contact.
Yeah, and so you've met like Tibetans back then, and you've met Tibetans like years since. So, how was the situation of Tibetans back then, and how would you say it's different to the current situation?
Okay, well, the Tibetans back then in Nepal, say,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, mostly they were making carpets, doing handicrafts, making ends meet. I suppose I then spent about 6 months in northern India.
Okay.
So I went to teachings, learned more about Buddhism, got interested in Buddhism,
Mm-hmm.
and attended different teachings, attended Kala Chakra, His Holiness.
Oh.
So began to get more of a feel, but I was determined to help Tibetans. So, at the back of my mind, when I got back to the UK, I thought, well, I don't know where any Tibetans are. And so I looked up Tibet. We had telephone directory then.
Yes.
There's no internet, there's no nothing. Telephone directory, 2 entries. One was Tibet Society, and the other was the Tibet shop, just off the King's Road.
Mm-hmm.
So I rang the Tibet Society and said, do you need any help? And they said, yes, we could do with volunteer.
Mm-hmm.
So I went and worked in the office, and that's where I met Ricky Hyde Chambers, and then in the shop I began to meet more Tibetans. So got to know the Tibetan community as it was then in London.
Mm.
But very few. I think the 10th of March
Mm-hmm.
probably had about 40 Tibetans.
Yeah, that's very less.
So at that time I probably knew
Mm-hmm.
most of the Tibetans. But now I don't know because there's so many,
Yes.
so many new ones. But the situation in the early days, you have to remember there was no internet, no telephone. So as a volunteer in Tibet Society, I'd be opening letters,
Mm-hmm.
talking about the situation, especially from the refugee angle. That they had nowhere to live, or they'd be mending the roads, or helping with medicinal things.
Mm-hmm.
And people would send in anything they'd send in stamps from this country, as money, as donations. And so it was a very early time, but we did raise quite a lot of money, often from people who'd been in India in the services, who felt strongly about Tibet.
Mm-hmm.
But at that time it was very hard to get any political news out, because there just wasn't the news coming out. Tibet at that time was still going through the Cultural Revolution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then the only pictures that started to come out were happy, smiling Tibetans wearing all their traditional costume, and Chinese government saying everything is fine, everything is happy. Until when the delegations started.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember my first visit to Tibet,
Mm-hmm.
which was 1981,
Okay.
which was just after Phuntsat Wangyal had been to Tibet on the second delegation.
Oh, okay.
So I was able to learn a lot from him about what it was like there, or what I should do or not do
Mm-hmm.
when I was there.
And so, have you met His Holiness the Dalai Lama?
I have met His Holiness the Dalai Lama.
Oh,
Yeah.
So, if you could expand more on your first meeting.
Okay, the very first time I saw him
Yeah.
was, when I was 21 in India, when he was giving Kala Chakra teachings.
Mm-hmm.
And, nowadays I look and see how many people are at those
It's a
teachings.
big crowd.
And, then I think there were about 40 of us Westerners, 40 Inji
Oh.
there. And so each, in the evenings, quite often we'd have a translation.
Okay.
But on one occasion, the Dalai Lama came himself,
Wow.
plus an interpreter, to try and explain to us
Mm-hmm.
what was happening. And then the second time I think I met him was when he was invited by the Tibet Society
Mm-hmm.
in London, and I was the youngest member of what was then called the Council of the Society and the Relief Fund. And I had just put on an exhibition of photographs of old Tibet, or of, proper Tibet. And one of the photographs in the exhibition, or two of the photographs in the exhibition, were of the Dalai Lama's mother. Front view and back view. And so I said, we can give these, if you like, to the society. And they said, yes, but we'd like you to give them because they come from you and you are the youngest member of the council. So I think Ugyen Lau dressed me up in a chuba. And then I gave him the picture. There were two pictures. So first of all, I gave him the front view. And then I said, in Tibetan, because I'd had to rehearse this, and this is the back view, which I hope you don't think he's being disrespectful. And he rocked with laughter and he said, front and back, all the same. It's what's inside that matters. And poked me in like that. So that was, that was my, proper meeting with him. And then I also met him quite soon after that, when I was trying to put on an exhibition. And I went to talk to him in Dharamsala. And in those days, it was, I suppose it must have been about 1978, something like that, 79. So that was just before I'd been to Tibet. But after I came back from Tibet, I visited him and told him, he asked lots of questions about what it was like there. And, the first time to Tibet, the very first time I went, you couldn't go as a tourist. So I was supposed to be leading a mountaineering group. And I'm definitely not a mountaineer. And when I met the group at Heathrow, I thought, they're not mountaineers, because they were, almost should have Zimmer frames and, they were elderly, but they were determined. And our hosts were the Chinese Mountaineering Association, who were on the tarmac in Beijing, all looking very smart like this.
And was that organised by the government? Chinese government?
Yes, and we came off the plane like this, and we had the bags that said Mount Everest Expedition. And I said, they're retired mountaineers. They weren't anything. But in those days, you couldn't go. The Jokang was closed for Tibetans. We could go, not Tibetans. And in those days, the Tibetans were only allowed to wear the greys and blues of sort of communist work camps.
Is that the one with the buttons? And
yeah, and they couldn't go inside. And we were watched quite carefully, but nothing like it is today. But we would, I would look, there were no guidebooks then. So I'd read lots of old books on Tibet and had old maps. And as we were travelling towards Everest, I'd say, can we go and have a picnic? And I'd sort of, find an interesting temple where there used to be an interesting temple. So we'd go off and find ruins, and Sami at that time was totally ruined, Sami Monastery. And the people, were you could tell how poor everybody was then. But I was able to visit, like Amala from Hazelmere. I managed to find her sisters, and neither the sisters nor Amala knew each other were alive. So that was a very moving moment, because I took presents, and that really showed how so many families had been split apart and had lost loved ones and things. Very moving.
Could you please tell us more about the work you do related to Tibet and in your country and beyond? Okay,
well, I'm very lucky because I managed to, combine my work and my interests together. So on the one hand, from a charitable point of view, working with the Society and Relief Fund, but on the other, I got a job in the Victoria and Albert Museum and dealing with Buddhist art. So I would, many people would come in to see the tankers, the bronzes, everything, and I would catalogue it. And so I explained to many people who came into the museum about Tibet.
Mm-hmm.
And then I left that job mainly because I was, well, various reasons, which I won't go into now, but that I was asked to help a German university catalogue Tibetan art all over the UK.
Okay.
So I went to all the different museums, and at that point met many people like Hugh Richardson, other people who had been in Tibet, before 1950. And I suppose that through that, I then began to do exhibitions for different people, which, Tibetan art is something that is very unique.
Mm-hmm.
Tibetan culture, Tibetan art, it's totally different from Chinese art. And so, I think it's one of the most distinctive and creative arts that there is in the world. So by exhibiting Tibetan art, you can put across a message and an awareness that Tibet has a very distinct identity.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one way of drawing people who might not be so interested in the cause of Tibet before into that whole world. And so that has been my life, really, has been raising awareness of Tibet through the art and culture, through exhibitions, through museum work, and through taking groups to places, but also through lectures. So if I lecture on Tibetan art, you will also get something political put into it at the end. Yeah.
Yeah, I think because Tibet has a rich history of art and culture, and then because it gives meaning to the Tibetan way of living and Tibetan identity, and so it has now become an important aspect of the Tibetan struggle at the present. So your work is really important, and then I'm sure I speak for every Tibetan. We really appreciate the work that you've done.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And to begin with, sort of in early 1970s, if you said something about Tibet, people would hardly know where Tibet was. Maybe if you mentioned the Dalai Lama, then that would mean something. So people were very unaware of Tibet at that time, or unaware. I'd say to people, and they'd say, "Oh, Tibet, that's a tiny country, isn't it?" I'd say, "No, it's vast. It's the size of Western Europe." And they say, "Really?" And so I think awareness has grown considerably. But thanks to all of you Tibetans here in the West now, who are really educating people.
So, in moving on to the next question, what would you say is the saddest moment in your long involvement in the Tibetan community or the Tibetan struggle?
I think two different occasions, I'll just say. One was in the west of Tibet, just seeing a very elderly Tibetan woman dressed in her chuba and the apron, but very tattered, probably because the only new clothes she had were Chinese clothes, which she didn't want to wear. But with her prayer wheel just going round and round about 3 rocks in the ground, which had been where her monastery used to be. And, with tears in her eyes. And that was incredibly moving. And that was sad-making too. And the other thing was, through the charity, we supported an orphanage in Lhasa. And I can't remember what date it was now, but 1990s probably. The authorities, she closed it down, and we don't know what happened to the Rinpoche who ran it was imprisoned and died in prison, and I don't know what happened to the other teachers, and we only know a couple of children got out to Dharamsala, but the children were just taken by truck and dumped in the middle of nowhere, and that was incredibly sad. And the only reason at that time it was easier to get information because Robbie Barnett had started Tibet Information Network, So we were able to track a bit more. But that was, that was very sad because it was something we knew the children, we knew the teachers, so it was a very personal moment of sadness. Yeah.
Do you have any reflections on Tibet or the current situation that you'd like to share more about?
I think the current situation, I was very hopeful at one point in 2008, sort of at the time when there was the riots, and people spoke on the television about Tibet. It was before the Olympics, about, dialogue progressing and this. And, there was some hope at that time. But then after the Chinese Olympics, everybody forgets again, and China. But I think the last time I went to Tibet was 2019. And the surveillance, the fear when you talk to people, everywhere we went, cameras, tape recorders, phones taken off, iPads taken away for 20 minutes at each checkpoint.
Oh.
So, I know I won't get a visa to go again, but, I think it has changed so much, and it's such a sophisticated surveillance now.
Yes.
But I think that the actual, since really over the last 2 years, what has been good is a much greater awareness of what the Chinese government is like.
Yeah.
Firstly you've got COVID, secondly you've got the Uyghurs. So you many more people, you get somebody saying, what happened to the Uyghurs terrible? And I say, well, yes, but it's also happened to the Tibetans.
Yes.
And I say today 15% of the male population of Tibet are back in re-education camps. So I think there is a greater awareness growing, and this is if, the Western countries can really put more pressure on China. Because this is something, they say, oh, we mentioned human rights, but they never really do it enough because they want the Chinese money. But as far as the, struggle for Tibet today, I'm immensely impressed, by all the young Tibetans I've met who are really doing so much good for the cause of Tibet, and are much, today with the internet, Twitter, all these different things which weren't available, when I was growing up. Suddenly there are many more ways to get out there and to do things. And I really think that is good, and that is only going to help that struggle. And I do think, it might not happen in my lifetime, but I think that there will be a day when Tibet will be free. I sincerely hope so.
Yes, we sure hope so. Yeah, I think I agree with your point as well. I think especially these days, because the Uyghur detention camps,
yeah,
and then Hong Kong,
Hong Kong,
democracy crisis,
and now Taiwan.
Yeah, and so I think because all of these communities are now coming together as well, so I think there's more pressure on China these days.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know, I can't remember when this was. It was when I was chairman. We had a meeting with the Uyghurs, with different ethnic minorities, if you like. Because if you add together all the ethnic minorities of China, it's greater in area than the Han. And we did have quite a good discussion, about moving together more in this struggle, really. But, you watch them with Taiwan today, and it's a very sort of aggressive attitude, isn't it?
Yes.
And I think people need to learn to stand up to China, but once they see Chinese money, or once they realise their trade with China is going to be stopped.
Yeah.
Like, I think Australia's been incredibly brave.
Yeah.
Right. But then they've got trade is slashed, and people say, oh.
What direction would you like the Tibetan struggle to take?
Well, I think there are two different things. I think, like we're saying, awareness has been raised a lot recently because of the situation with COVID and the Uyghurs and everything. And so I think it is, raising much more awareness of the general public, however one does that. Mm-hmm. And I think that there should be much more boycotting of buying things from China. Even in our supermarket, we grow garlic at home, mm-hmm. but I didn't have enough garlic ready. I went to the supermarket, pick up a garlic grown in China. Just one. So whatever you buy, mm-hmm. If you look carefully, most of it comes from China, mm-hmm. and that's half the problem in getting governments to think in a different way. But the other thing I think is maybe amongst younger people, within the universities. I mean, I think these Confucius institutes are terrible.
Yes.
But I think if there is a way of befriending Chinese students and trying to, because they've been brainwashed, propaganda, to try and explain the truth about Tibet. Mm-hmm. And because many more of them now are much more savvy because of the internet, and especially if they're in the West, mm-hmm. They can access much more information. So I think things are moving in the right direction if there can be much more pressure. And as I've said, I do think, my hair will have probably dropped out by then, but that Tibet will be free again one day, because things change. Russia changes. Germany, the wall came down. Yeah. Different things happen. Mm-hmm. It might take a while, but I hope it doesn't take too long.
Yeah, and I think, with the COVID and lockdown and then the supply chain issues, and then now nations are trying to focus, have the supply chain in their own country. So hopefully that makes boycotting Chinese products easier.
I think the other thing too is years ago I had a group from Tibet Foundation of dancers from exile, mm-hmm. and from Tibet itself. Now those two groups, I tried to make them mix together, but they wouldn't really. We put separate rooms. In the end, they wanted separate food. And I think that's very sad. I think that it's difficult when people arrive in Dharamsala if they can't integrate. Mm. So that probably needs work too, from both sides. Mm-hmm.
So you have visited Tibet several times now. And so can you tell us the difference, like the changes you've seen over the periods of your visit?
Okay. Well, the first time, 1981, mm-hmm. Was destruction and real poverty. And when I went back again a few years later, maybe 84, 85, there were improvements, but for who? So there was roads and slightly better houses. And I suppose the biggest change has happened in the last, I think there was a big gap. I went in 2008 and was amazed how large Lhasa was. Mm. But today, Lhasa is a complete city with these very expensive shopping malls, frequented by lots of Chinese, mm-hmm. but there's also brothels, nightclubs, gambling. I think that there have been changes all for the Chinese themselves, or to push down the Tibetans. Any big operation involves Chinese workers coming in. So I think, okay, some of the living conditions have improved, mm-hmm. But from the point of the religion has been really crushed, unless it's superficial for the tourist benefit.
Yes.
They're quite happy with people spinning prayer wheels. But if they're going to pay allegiance to His Holiness or do anything like that, then the crackdown comes. I think I was very depressed after my last visit because of the surveillance, because a Tibetan I know very well, and I've worked with him before, you could tell how scared he was of talking to me, of talking to anybody. He said, I can't talk. So the fear is palpable, because he knew he would lose his job, he'd lose his livelihood. So I think that they have become so much more sophisticated with listening in, with filming people, and probably getting Tibetans in their pay, so that's why there's such fear and panic. I think in the countryside things are a little bit freer, but still you're watched. And so I said, right, I'm not going again. Because throughout my career, I have always been quite careful, because I know otherwise I won't get a visa to take people there.
Yeah.
But now I'm going to speak, because then if I don't get a visa, I don't get a visa.
And then nowadays, like, you see more and more pictures of Chinese tourists, especially
lots of Chinese tourists.
Pasapako area, in front of Chongqing, taking pictures with like Tibetan.
There are a lot of like models made up to the nines in Tibetan costume, holding onto a prayer wheel, for the camera.
Yeah.
And it's pretty sick making.
Yeah, I think you can, like, in a few pictures you can see the locals,
Yeah.
You can see their reaction. Like,
but it's also always, stepping on the locals.
Yeah, very much.
No, excuse me, can I stand here and have my picture taken? Pushing an old man out of the way.
That's very sad.
So there's that sort of superiority complex.
Yeah, very sad.
But on the other hand, there is a positive thing, that there are many more Chinese who are more interested in Buddhism and have a bit more respect. So you've got two things.
Yeah. So the next question, because you are an expert of Tibetan art, so what is your favorite object of Tibetan art?
Oh wow, that's really complicated. I have so many.
Yeah.
It's like desert island discs. Well, because I've worked with different museums, there are many beautiful objects in museums, but I could never have them because they belong to somebody else. So perhaps I'll just talk about, my first Tibetan object, which was given to me by a Tibetan refugee who had escaped across the border, and she had wanted us to buy some things, and I had said no. And then she gave me a Tibetan tea bowl. And so I still have that tea bowl. It's more sentimental worth than monetary worth. But then I went on to sponsor her daughter, because they'd come out of Tibet, ended up in Darjeeling. And then her daughter worked in the Delek hospital in Dharamsala, but is now in America. But still, she's married to a Tibetan. But I think just that connection was very strong, especially because I was young then. I was 21 and learning about Tibet. But there are many wonderful objects. But I think, again, it's interesting working in museums because pressure gets put on by China. So whether you put Tibet on the label, or like in the British Museum today, it doesn't say Tibet, it says Tibetan area China or something like that. So, I think as curators or doing exhibitions, we have to be very good at putting across that this is Tibetan art, totally distinct from China.
China claims that since the occupation of Tibet, they have liberated Tibet and then brought prosperity to Tibet. But then Tibetan society and Bhutanese society are very similar. But Bhutan has achieved has progress without the need of Tibetan Chinese occupation. So do you agree with the Chinese?
I don't agree with the Chinese. I think all the countries I visit, which is all the way along across the Himalayas, the one thing you have to understand about China is China has money, China talks. So for instance, I've seen massive changes in Nepal because they are in China's pocket. So you see these new buildings going up and you say, who built those? Oh, the Chinese gave us money. Now, Tibetans living in Nepal, I have many good Tibetan friends there, if they go and celebrate the birthday of His Holiness, that birthday celebration at Bodh Gaya, which is a simple birthday celebration, is stopped because of pressure from China. Now, I think that's frightening. That's scary. You go to Ladakh, it's free. It's like Tibet was before, and everything is flourishing. Well, not everything flourishing, but a lot of things flourishing. Bhutan is now semi-democratic with a royal family, and it works. They don't need the Chinese. All these countries are sandwiched between, China and India.
Yeah.
So they all have to be careful, to a certain extent, of how they play these big neighbours off against one another. And in Bhutan's case, it looked to India, but it had the added bonus that it could see what had happened to Tibet. So they knew what had happened in Tibet. So quickly, they turned to India. So I think China's claims that they have liberated Tibet is not the case. And normally, again, from the point of view of the British, they say it's been liberated from imperialism. And when they came into Tibet, there were only 5 Westerners there. So why would you want to liberate it from 5 Westerners? So, and I know on my one of my first visits in the 80s, we were always told, we have rescued, the Chinese guide would say, we've rescued this barbaric nation. And, we are very sophisticated people. And they put these tapes on sometimes. They'd put on Tchaikovsky, Swan Lake. They say, this is a very famous composer from Russia. You won't know about it in your country. And you think, well, we're not that ill-educated either, So, but I do think they're very cunning with the way that they alter history. So, textbooks, everything is being altered so that younger children will read the history of Tibet as seen through Chinese eyes. And I think that's very worrying, because education is so important, the right sort of education, to know for Tibetans their identity.
That is the end of my questions.
Thank you.
So once again, thank you very much for joining us. And your journey and your affection for Tibetan art and Tibetan culture is very inspiring, and thank you.
Thank you. Tuesday.